recognize Ranking Member Paul for sharing his opening remarks.
In the prophetic words of John Adams from 1765, liberty cannot be preserved without a general knowledge among the people of the character and conduct of their rulers. Fast forward nearly 250 years, and the essence of Adams' assertion couldn't be more pertinent. As we convene today, we are at a crossroads, facing a critical question. How do we navigate the legacy of Adams' vision in our times? Rather than honoring its duty to operate with transparency and accountability to the American people, the federal bureaucracy has become adept at shielding crucial information from public scrutiny and congressional oversight, all while squandering substantial manpower and resources in the process. In recent years, the executive branch's obsession with secrecy has become even more extreme. Take, for example, the persistent efforts over the past 4 years by the federal government to obscure information from the American people concerning COVID-19. For 4 long years, dozens of agencies across our government have systematically obstructed my requests for information. Even requests that have now come jointly with the chairman have been obstructed. They've refused to disclose thousands of relevant records in their possession. Over 8 months ago, Chairman Peters and I sent a letter to the HHS requesting these 2 documents. This document, 250 pages, all redacted. It's not classified. This document, nearly 300 pages, all redacted. This is what the response of government is to our requests, to reasonable requests. These are non-classified requests, and the government is obscuring them from us. Last year, Congress unanimously passed a law requiring the declassification of records relating to COVID origins and the Wuhan Institute of Virology. In fact, today is the 1-year anniversary of that bill being signed into law by President Biden. Did the Biden administration adhere to this statutory directive? We've gotten virtually nothing. The answer, regrettably, is a resounding no. Instead, what we received was a paltry, unclassified summary appended by a classified annex. So the order to declassify things was given to us in a classified document. This pattern of evasion is not limited to Congress. Our witness today, Mr. Gary Ruskin of U.S. Right to Know, has filed 97 Freedom of Information Act requests and 25 lawsuits in his effort to obtain information from the executive branch, and he's probably been largely more successful than any of us in getting information from the administration. U.S. Right to Know is one of the countless organizations fighting for the disclosure of records related to COVID-19. Nearly all of the records concerning the origins of COVID have come from these groups obtaining court orders to force the executive branch to comply. That is disappointing that we have no voluntary compliance. It only comes from a court order. This is unacceptable. Every one of the federal FOIA officers should be at this witness table today telling us why they are costing the taxpayer thousands of dollars fighting records requests in court, spilling black reductions all over the pages that should be public, and obstructing our congressional mandate to perform oversight over the federal government. This obstructionism, typified by extensive redactions, bureaucratic red tape, and legal barricades, undermines the very foundation of our democracy. The importance of a transparent record system cannot be overstated. When the government cloaks its actions in secrecy, it fosters an environment of mistrust. Federal bureaucrats appear to have no shame in their efforts to evade freedom of information laws and withhold information from the public. For example, David Morenz, one of Dr. Fauci's top advisors, is accused of improperly deleting COVID-19 origins material and using his own personal email to avoid FOIA during the pandemic. How do we know this? Well, he admitted it in writing. Dr. Morenz's own emails show that he hides his NIH work from FOIA by using Gmail. In a September 2021 email, Dr. David Morenz wrote, "As you know, I try to communicate on Gmail because my NIH government email is FOIA'd constantly. Stuff sent to my Gmail gets to my phone, but not to my NIH computer." He's willfully telling people to break the law to avoid the Freedom of Information Act. If that wasn't bad enough, He even said he would delete anything that he didn't want to see in the New York Times, also against the law. It is imperative that we hold these federal agencies to a higher standard. The government has a constitutional duty to respond to our requests and provide adequate answers and access to records. Today's hearing will shine a light on the failures of our current public records and freedom of information laws. As we spotlight the shortcomings of our present public records and freedom of information statutes, let it be known that this is not a matter of partisan divide. It is a matter of principle, of upholding the constitutional rights of every American. Mr. Chairman, I hope to work together to identify serious reforms to bring transparency and accountability back to government. The American people deserve nothing less. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter the Dr. Moren's emails into the record. I also ask unanimous consent to enter into the record statements from 2 transparency groups and 1 investigative reporter, all working hard to obtain documents.
Without objection.
Senator Paul. Ms. Powers, on April 26, 2023, you testified before this committee that USAID did not fund gain-of-function research. I'd like to give you a chance to correct the record. Is it still your position that USAID did not fund gain-of-function research?
We have no evidence that USAID has funded gain-of-function research, and we certainly haven't authorized gain-of-function research.
Well, I'll help you. Behind me, we'll list a paper from 2015. This is a paper produced by the Wuhan Institute of Virology and also by Dr. Barrick from UNC. In this paper, if you'll see the funding aspect that's highlighted, it says USAID, EPT, predict funding from EcoHealth Alliance. So this paper was one where they took a virus, the SARS virus, the backbone of the SARS virus, and then took an S protein from an unknown virus they found in the wild and put them together. Are you aware that these experiments in the study were supported by USAID, Predict, and Grant through EcoHealth Alliance?
As I said, USAID has not authorized gain-of-function research. This is the first time seeing this. We're happy to look into it.
This has been around since 2015. We've been over it numerous times. It's been in the public record. We've repeatedly said that, yes, USAID did fund gain-of-function research. Here's the evidence. But here's some comments from some different people about this study, because some will try to argue this still is not gain-of-function. Simon Wayne Hobson is a virologist at the Pasteur Institute in Paris. He points out that the researchers have created, with this research funded by USAID, a novel virus that grows remarkably well in human cells. If the virus escaped, nobody could predict the trajectory. Richard Ebright from Rutgers says, the only impact of this work is the creation in a lab of a new, non-natural risk to humanity. So is your position that this study was not gain-of-function or that you didn't fund it? Which is your position?
We have had an awful lot of back and forth and provided thousands of pages of documents on this. This article, it looks like it's from 2015.
Right.
So we will have to look into the specific claims. But again, to put on the record,
it's a big
USAID
point.
has not
But
and
actually,
will not
that is your
authorize
position.
gain-of-function
I know that's your
research.
position, but the record will show that you did.
Well,
and this was before your time. I don't know why we can't just admit it. It did happen. And the reason this is important is many people want to collect all these viruses from around the world, but they don't want to just collect the viruses to sort of have them and have a library of viruses. They take the virus, then they take an S protein from another virus, and they create a virus that doesn't exist in nature that often has ramifications that could be quite different or quite serious. I'll give you the words of the authors of this paper. On the basis of these findings, scientific review panels may deem similar studies building chimeric viruses based on circulating strains too risky to pursue. So this was funded by USAID. It was funded through the PREDICT program. There's no question of that. And even the authors admit that it was gain of function. So we have to get beyond sort of quibbling over whether it was, because we have to make sure in the future we're not doing this and that we don't fund this going forward. Now, the PREDICT program was going to be surpassed by another program going after viruses, and that has been suspended. That is all good. But we have to admit the past, be truthful about the past in order to go forward, because Millions of people died from COVID-19. The FBI has concluded it came from a lab in Wuhan. The Department of Energy has concluded that. Even the CIA initially, their scientific board, voted 6-1 until they were overturned by higher-ups at the CIA to say otherwise. They voted to say that this thing came from the lab as well. It only comes from the lab if we're in favor of creating these things. We can't control everything China does, but we certainly shouldn't be funding it. So we have to be honest that this was funded. Now, there was a warning sign to us that this was going on. There was something called the Diffuse Project in 2018 that was presented to DARPA, once again by Barrick and by Dr. Shi in Wuhan.
It's okay.
The Diffuse Project was to create a coronavirus with a furin cleavage site, which doesn't exist in nature but makes it incredibly more infectious in humans. There was a briefing to 15 agencies. One of the agencies was USAID. There was a briefing about this Diffuse Project. But nobody from USAID and nobody from all 15 agencies ever told anyone about this project. It was hidden for years and years and only revealed by a brave Lieutenant Colonel Marine working at DARPA who exposed this when everybody else had hidden this. And my question is, USAID was in this briefing about a research project that had incredible danger to our country and finally wasn't funded. Will you provide the names of the people from USAID who were in this meeting so they can be interviewed so we can find out why didn't they tell anyone, or did they tell their superiors and people ignored them? Why was the public never made aware that they were trying to do dangerous research to create a virus very similar to what COVID-19 became? And how could 15 agencies show up for a briefing and no one expose it to the public, and we only hear about it by a whistleblower? Will you provide for us the name of the person at the USAID who attended this briefing in 2018 and let us interview them to find out what happened? Why was this never revealed to the public?
So I think within the 10,000 pages of documents you have from USAID are whatever documents we have on this DARPA proposers meeting. I received the letter, we received the letter from your staff yesterday. We'll certainly look at the request. But just to give a little context, U.S. government agencies often, on good days, show up for one another, go to each other's meetings. This is not something that USAID ever considered funding or was ever engaged on in some substantive way.
But the point is that after hearing that somebody wanted to put a furin cleavage site in the virus, alarm bells go off. And then when you see the virus in 2020 and you say, oh my goodness, they did what they were asking, someone should have said, wow, I was in that hearing and I didn't think anything of it at the time, but now I'm like, maybe I should tell somebody, maybe I should call up the president, maybe I should call up Anthony Fauci, maybe somebody should be informed that we learned about this and I didn't think anything of it at the time. You're right, it could have been inconsequential in 2018. In 2020, it becomes profoundly important. Why didn't anybody from government come forward to warn us that this could be a virus not from nature, which is not very infectious usually, and was incredibly infectious because it had been pre-adapted in a lab for human transmission?
Look, I just want to come back to your earlier point. All of this ended at USAID in 2020. It is before my time. We don't feel defensive about these engagements. We've appreciaed
That's all we're asking for is we'd like to interview the person who was at that meeting.
Underlying bill without objection, so ordered. Is there further, Senator or Ranking Member Paul, you're recognized for some comments.
I agree with the chairman that oversight of federal records is lacking, that we need to do more. We had a good hearing on this, and it's something that I think in principle we agree on. I think a bill to actually work has to have some punishment. We're currently investigating David Morenz, who is an assistant to Anthony Fauci at NIH, who remarked in his email that please send your email communications with me to my non-governmental email because they're FOIAing my governmental email all the time. The rumor is that he still works for the NIH. Some say he's on administrative leave. Some people say he's being paid. We can't get an answer from NIH whether he's there or not there or even being paid. So before I sign on to any legislation like this, we'd like to discuss further penalties to be attributed. We'd also like your help in getting the NIH to tell us, does this man still work there? Does he not work there? What is his punishment? Because if you're going to flagrantly, a person like this that works for the federal government, flagrantly say, use my private email, and there's more information coming forward on this gentleman, but the NIH won't even tell us if he still works there. I mean, that's crazy that we can't even find out whether a guy who says, don't use my government email, use my private email, whether he still works there. So there has to be, we think, more penalties added to the bill, and we'd love to have your help in trying to get this information on this particular government employee.
If there is no further,
I don't think it has to be partisan at all. Example that somebody who once worked for Russ Feingold is in complete agreement with somebody who is from the other party and an opposite wing of the other party, that there's definitely overlap. I think there's overlap between the chairman and I on this issue. I think when you watch this unfold, you tend to see Republicans louder when Biden abuses of power and Democrats louder when Trump abuses of power. But I can say that when Trump moved the money around using emergency powers for the wall, I was one of the 12 Republicans who voted to rein in that power and that it wasn't appropriate use, it was abuse of power. I think as far as an adversarial relationship, there needs to be some. It needs to be the legislature against the executive like the good old days when we could combine Republicans and Democrats to always say, we are going to do, as Madison said, pit our ambition against their ambition, and those checks in power would be the way the republic would remain protected. We don't do that enough. I can't remember when. It's been decades since the legislature rose up and said enough's enough. We did a little bit in the 1970s. The Church Commission was a reaction to too much executive power and too much power within the intelligence agencies. But I can tell you how bad it is right now. I'm trying to get the classified Church Commission report from the 70s and can't get it. So the administration, the executive, but how is the only way I could get it? Somebody on appropriations would have to call up the current administration and say, give it to them or we're not giving you any more money. That's the way it would work, and it shouldn't matter which party we're in. But I can't get the classified Church Commission report from the 1970s, which I think came out of this committee or what committee? It was a special committee, but I mean, it's like, it was a Senate product, and I can't get it. So, I mean, it's just kind of crazy, the resistance of the executive branch. I think everybody here understands how things got turned over topsy-turvy by Chadha, but I think it's important explaining to the public what we mean by that. The legislative veto would mean you could just come back in and the legislature could veto an emergency power or end it. And then the president didn't have to sign it. The court came back and said, no, you can't have any laws. And there's some logic to this. You can't have a law unless the president signs it. So the only way we gain our power is we have to let things expire. So the emergency powers have to expire. And this is getting to my question. Most of the emergency powers, I think as researched by the Brennan Center and as mentioned by Mr. Healy as well, are under IEPA. So previously we tried to do this and then we say, oh gosh, but we love sanctions. Everybody loves sanctions. We don't want to do anything to have sanctions expire. But if you exclude IEPA, you exclude like 90% of the emergency powers. And so the real question shouldn't be, do you love sanctions or do you have doubts about sanctions? Do you think sanctions should be forever and Congress should never weigh in? Maybe if you love sanctions, we should still vote on them. And they should expire and come back here in 6 months or a year and we vote on them. And if you love them, I think the majority of people probably, I'm in the minority, the majority will probably still vote for sanctions on everybody all the time, everywhere. But there would at least be a debate and we put our imprimatur on it. And then by putting our imprimatur on it, if you love sanctions, actually the sanctions may be stronger because they're not actually approved by Congress. But right now we have no say in it and they go on. And most of the emergency powers, there's really dangerous ones, internet kill switch and things, but there's also ones that are used all the time, which are sanctions, increasingly used on private individuals in other countries, sometimes used in Americans in other countries. So I guess my question to all three of you, and we'll start with Mr. Healy, is do you think the reform that time limits emergency decrees and says that they have to be affirmatively voted on by Congress should apply to IEPA emergencies?
I think ultimately it should be under an approve or expire framework. Now, I think there's reasonable debate that can be had about, time limits and particular provisions or whether it should all be part of the same bill. But I think if you were looking down a list of extraordinary emergency powers, such as the Brennan Center has produced, it first came out in 2018 before the last two controversial uses of emergency powers. If you were looking down that list, you wouldn't have singled out the Military Construction Codification Act that was the basis of the border wall emergency, or the HEROES Act that was the basis of the student loan debt cancellation. You know, I don't think they'd be anywhere near the top of your list of broad, crazy delegations of power. I think looking behind a veil of ignorance, looking at that list, you would identify IEPA as something that can be turned against U.S. persons and something that can essentially make people financial untouchables, and you'd be concerned about that.
I think you're right, and I just wanted to interject that during the middle of COVID, they took a CDC statute from the 1930s that said you can quarantine people for measles and like 10 other diseases and whatever other measures are necessary. And through that, the Trump administration canceled mortgages and said you don't have to pay your mortgages. Then the Biden administration did the same thing. So both parties were guilty of this, but they took a statute that had nothing to do with mortgages, and no sane person could think that a quarantine on measles has anything to do with paying your mortgage, and they abused that power. But that should be, whether you like people paying their mortgages or not, or like the rule of law, everybody should say that's illegal and unconstitutional. We shouldn't let executives do that, but we don't. We tend to base it on the policy. Do we like the policy or we don't like the policy, instead of should the president be able to do this unilaterally on a statute that never gave him this? Ms. Goitens, on including IEPA?
I think IEPA raises unique considerations and should be addressed separately. I think the National Emergencies Act reform bills that are currently pending both go too far and not far enough in certain ways. I think that requiring Congress to vote 40 times every year on sanctions regimes, which is what would happen if you apply the NEA reform bills to IEPA declarations, would be impracticable and possibly unnecessary. And so I think a modified...
They possibly could be grouped as well.
I think
mean,
that's
if you have
right.
an emergency against Russia and there are 40 different sanctions against Russia, I don't think there's anything that says that we couldn't come forward and vote on the emergency that includes 40 different sanctions, not each individual sanction.
I think you would need to structure a system where there could be a vote on with expedited procedures on a package of sanctions once every year with amendments in order to strip individual sanctions regimes. I think that's
But
probably...
once again, only works if they expire.
That's correct. But that's a slightly different framework than what's in the bills that are currently pending before Congress. And I would add that this approval requirement would not solve some of the other problems with IEPA, such as the absence of due process protections for Americans who are swept up in its crosshairs, such as the humanitarian impacts on innocent foreign populations overseas. So
I agree with all that. The only problem with separating it is Congress is, as I said in my opening, often feckless, if not most of the time. So if we ever do anything on NEA, it'll be a miracle if we actually pass it through and get it completely done. But I would say that if we leave out IEPA, we're leaving out an opportunity when what we're talking about is emergencies, and people are going to say, oh, you got rid of 4 emergencies out of 79 or something. You know, we're going to get rid of the minority, we're going to fix a minority of the problem. So if anything, I'd argue for doing it all at one time. Mr. Thal?
I mean, so to answer your question, should it be addressed? Yes, and I agree that I think there are 2 concerns there, not with the intent. One is structurally how those emergency powers tend to work in practice. The second is prudential. And putting on my staffer hat, I remember negotiating about how much to include of IEPA and whether or not to. Look, as a principle, I think you're right. I just caution the committee that you have a reform or a version of reform that is within grasp and that could pass Congress and could get to the president's desk. Wholesale, including IEPA, just increases the complexity, which doesn't mean don't go for it, but it just becomes that much more slippery. And it's like trying to pick up antimatter with chopsticks or something. Like the number of committees that get involved and like the Treasury Department, it just becomes, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good is my only thing I would add, even though I agree with the intent.
Could I add one thing to that, just briefly? I think you're only going to get one bite at the IEPA apple. Take the time to do it right. Don't throw some provisions about IEPA into the national emergencies reform bills that exist right now. Those bills are ready to go. Get them signed and take the time to do an IEPA reform bill. The Biden Center has a proposal for legislative reform of IEPA. I would be happy to work with anyone on this committee who would like to examine that as a path forward. But move forward with National Emergencies Act reform and then take the time to get IEPA right.
Senator Ossoff, you're...
It is my pleasure to enthusiastically endorse a champion of liberty, the chairman of the Freedom Caucus, a great constitutional conservative, Bob Good. And I don't want to get into a contest with him. I guess he's married 36 years. I'm just on my 34th year. But I'm so happy to have my wife Kelly with me. So a lot of you know what our routine is like. We, a lot of us are home during the weekends. We fly up. Do you fly or you drive from here? Most of the rest of us have to fly. We're farther away. Fly up at the beginning of the week, come back towards the end of the week, and we're always glad to get home. And so sometimes people are frustrated. They want us to do more. It's like, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? You say this, but why don't you do something? So I get home and I figure at least my wife will understand me, right? So I get home at the end of the week and I expect her to be at the front door with either slippers or a hug and a kiss. You know what she says to me when I come in? How come Anthony Fauci's not in jail? They have him today before committee. I saw a little snippet of it before I got on the plane, and his lips were moving, so you know he's lying. Interesting, though, these people don't miss a beat. He had a 5-minute opening statement. He spent the first couple minutes disavowing his aide of 20 years. He barely knows him, barely remembers his name. He says he didn't report to me. There was probably, I can't remember who, but there's probably somebody between me and him. Could he come into your office when he wanted? Oh, no. Did he? Oh, yes, sometimes, but no, he was not in my inner circle. He did not come to meetings. Everything to disavow this guy, because what's this guy admitted to doing? Destroying evidence. What did he say in his emails? Anthony Fauci was also destroying evidence. How'd they learn how to destroy evidence? Well, they went to the IT woman, the FOIA lady, the person who works for the government who's supposed to be instructing them on turning over information so we can see it, so Congress can see it. She was teaching them how to destroy the evidence. Somebody needs to go to jail.
A lot of people have to go.
The problem is, I think there's 2 tiers of justice now. There was a time in our country, and it was not a good time, when people were not treated fairly in this country based on the color of their skin. When people didn't have equal protection, people went to court, and because of the color of their skin, I don't think they were treated fairly. It's not as much now, though, the color of your skin, as it is the shade of your ideology. I'm worried if you pray to God, if you teach your kids at home, if you're pro-life, somebody protests in front of Planned Parenthood, they get 20 years. Somebody destroys the pregnancy center up here, what do they get? It's not the same justice that's going around. It's going to lead to further and further unhappiness. You may remember this lady, what's her name? Hillary Clinton. So she paid $8 million to her lawyers to give to a Russian spy to get a made-up dossier called the Steele dossier, which then was leaked illegally through the FISA court. They take the FISA court, and $60 million later, they don't find any evidence linking Trump to the Russians. It was, how was it filed? Beating me to the punchline. How was it filed? As a legal expense. How was she punished? $8,000 fine, no prosecution. It's a double standard, but it's driving this country apart. But I think if they put him in jail on July 11th, it'll be a landslide election. He'll win in the land. Today we are here to examine one of the most critical and debated questions of our time. Did COVID-19 originate in a lab? To answer this question, let's revisit the early days of the pandemic and examine what some of Dr. Anthony Fauci's inner circle said privately about the origins of the virus. Discussions that were only revealed through FOIA litigation. Christian Anderson wrote, "The lab escape version of this is so friggin' likely to have happened because they were already doing this type of work, and the molecular data is fully consistent with that scenario." Ian Lipkin stressed the nightmare of circumstantial evidence to assess regarding the possibility of inadvertent release, given the scale of bat coronavirus research pursued in Wuhan. Bob Gary said, "I really can't think of a plausible natural scenario where you get from the bat virus or one very similar to it to COVID-19, where you insert exactly 4 amino acids, 12 nucleotides, and all have to be added at the exact same time to gain this function. I just can't figure out how this gets accomplished in nature." According to Gary, it's not crackpot to suggest this could have happened given the gain-of-function research we know was happening at Wuhan. These are all private statements, which you'll discover today differ greatly from their public statements. Even Ralph Barrick, world-famous gain-of-function researcher and collaborator with Wuhan's Dr. Shi, admitted, so they, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, have a very large collection of viruses in their laboratory. And so it's, proximity is a problem. It's a problem. Federal court orders reveal that even Dr. Fauci himself privately acknowledged concerns about gain-of-function research in Wuhan and mutations in the virus that suggest it might have been engineered, just days before he commissioned the proximal origin paper. Despite these private doubts, publicly these so-called experts and their allies were dismissing the lab leak theory as a conspiracy. Within days, Anderson, Lipkin, and Gary were putting final touches on what would be remembered as one of the most remarkable reversals in modern history. In their proximal origin paper, these scientists concluded, "We do not believe that any type of laboratory-based scenario is plausible." Privately, they were saying one thing. Publicly, they were saying another. Media pundits parroted the narrative while social media platforms censored discussion about the lab leak, labeling it as misinformation and stifling open discourse about the virus's origins. The cover-up went beyond public statements. Federal agencies and key officials withheld and continue to conceal crucial information from both Congress and the public. For instance, Dr. David Morenz of the NIH deleted emails that could have contained valuable insights into early discussions. When he deleted them, he made the comment, "I think we're safe now." He deleted emails. He said, "The early emails I've deleted," to Peter Daszak at EcoHealth, "I think we're safe now." The ODNI failed to comply with a law that was passed unanimously. One of the senators on this committee got it passed. We were going to declassify all this and revealed it, and the administration has refused. HHS and NIH have not produced documents related to the gain-of-function research that the chairman and I requested nearly a year ago. I've been asking for 2 or 3 years as an individual member with some other Republican members and have not gotten these records. I've now asked with the Democrat chairman over a year, and they're still resisting. They say it's not gain-of-function. Well, let's hear the debate. Did they debate at NIH whether it was gain-of-function in Wuhan? If there's a debate, let's hear the scientific arguments on both sides. They will not give us that information. This has been a deliberate, prolonged effort to deceive the committee about certain gain-of-function research experiments that the agencies have been withholding. What we have found as we've gone through this is that at every step there's been resistance. So the hearing today is to try to find out whether or not we can get to the truth. Do we know for certain it came from the lab? No, but there's a preponderance of evidence indicating that it may have come from the lab. Do we know viruses have come from animals in the past? Yes, they've come from animals in the past. But this time there's no animal reservoir. There's no animal handlers with antibiotics. There's a lot of reasons why there are indications that this could well have come from the lab. This is what the discussion we'll have today. This is a discussion that's long in coming. It's been over 3 years that we've been asking for this, but this is great. This is good. We'll have scientists on both sides of this issue, and I hope we have a spirited debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Paul. It is the practice of this. Ranking Member Paul, you're recognized for your questions.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit statements for the record from U.S. Right to Know, Open the Books, America First Legal, Frontiers of Freedom, and Dr. Alina Chan.
Without objection.
So just in the last few minutes, Dr. Gary has told us that this couldn't have come from bats. It had to go through an intermediate host. That may well be true, but arguing against that is they tested 90,000 some odd animals, and there is no animal host that's been found. But what he also doesn't tell you is the animal host could be a laboratory animal. It could be passed serially through that, and that's one way of quickly adapting and pushing natural selection to adapt a virus towards humans. Dr. Alina Chan has written extensively about this, how this virus didn't show up clunky and poorly transmissible. This virus showed up immediately very transmissible in humans, as if it had been pre-adapted in a lab. Dr. Ebright, Dr. Gary tells us that he's wedded to the scientific method and that he considered all the different possibilities in proximal origins. And I know you're a professor, and I'm assuming you've been the senior author on many papers. I assume that you teach your younger researchers what is good scientific method and not good scientific method. In the abstract of proximal origins, Dr. Gary and his fellow authors state categorically that the virus is not a laboratory construct. That doesn't sound to me like open-mindedness, and I wonder what you would tell a younger researcher or someone you were instructing in the scientific method about putting categorical statements into a scientific paper.
Well, it's important to emphasize that the paper in question, Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, published in March 2020, was not a research article. It was an opinion piece. It was published as a commentary, which is the section in the journal that holds opinion pieces and editorials. So it was an opinion piece. The authors were stating their opinion. But that opinion was not well-founded. In March of 2020, there was no basis to state that as a conclusion, as opposed to simply being a hypothesis. Moreover, we know that compelling evidence has been presented as a result of congressional inquiry in the House that 4 of the authors of that paper, Dr. Anderson, Dr. Gary, Dr. Holmes, and Dr. Rambeau, in their private communications, show clearly that they knew the conclusion that they stated in that article was invalid. So in terms of what I would tell a younger scientist I would be mentoring, I would tell a younger scientist that you do not state a conclusion without evidence, even in an opinion piece in a scientific journal. And you never, under any circumstances in a scientific journal, state conclusions that you know to be unsound. That represents scientific misconduct. It represents scientific misconduct up to and including fraud. And the paper in question, the Proximal Origin paper, has been recommended for review of retraction. 2 requests, one in 2023 and one in 2024, were submitted by teams of scientists to the journal in question, to the journal editors, asking them to add an editorial expression of concern and to initiate a review for retraction of the article.
I know of no other example in modern scientific history or publications where a publication has come forward pronouncing with such authority that the lab leak is implausible, it is not a laboratory construct, while privately saying, this is no friggin' conspiracy theory, it looks like it did, I'm 90-10, I'm 50-50. But no doubt in the paper. In fact, we know that it went back and forth with Dr. Fauci and with editors who say, we want the statements to be stronger. We want the conclusions to be stronger. That was actually coming from Nature at the time. We want you to doctor it up and even be more strong because we're making a political point here. That's where we should have known we were off track, that these people were politicians and that they were pushing an idea because, as Dr. Collins finally admitted in one of the emails, this is about the business of science with China. This will disturb our relations with China if anybody questions this. Dr. Quay, the idea that this came from the fish market, I thought had been discredited by virtually all of scientists. Now, I'm really surprised it's still being presented here. I know that the Chinese, the CDC, George Gao over there, basically said that they no longer consider it. And actually, if you think about it from their perspective, we're not sure if we can trust them, but at the same time, the Chinese, if they would rather have it come from a lab or the market, I think would choose the market over the lab. If anything, they would be, if we were going to think they were dishonest, would be dishonest towards saying, hey, we found some animals. But if you could review stepwise, just a little bit slower, some of the evidence for why it's not there, the amount of animals tested, the animal handlers compared to SARS-1, but also the idea of this genetic diversity that, when SARS-1 came about the first time, I think it tried hundreds of times because these animal viruses don't infect humans well in the beginning. It tried hundreds of times over and over again. And even in the end, SARS-1 didn't transmit between humans very well. That's why containment worked. And that's why quarantine worked, because it wasn't very infectious. But go through a little bit, step by step, the evidence of why anybody still maintaining that it came from the market is misguided.
Sure. I mean, let me agree with Dr. Gary about SARS-1 being a spillover, and let me elaborate a little bit. There were 11 cities, 11 markets, 3 different lineages, and a 30 nucleotide difference among the initial cases and patients, which approximates about a year of posterior diversity, as it's called. SARS-2, of course, it's either in one market or it's in no markets. There's no other proposal for a market origin from it. 457 animals were tested in the market. 0 were found to be infected. SARS-1, 92 animals, 100% infected. The vendors, the wildlife vendors in SARS-1 were all infected. We have 10 vendors here. None of them are infected. One vendor had bamboo rats from southern China, where the backbone comes from. He wasn't infected. His animals weren't infected. SARS-2 has no posterior diversity. So it really, as Dr. Anderson said, it's one jump from one animal to one human. The most likely place that happens is in a laboratory. And again, to be clear, when you say an animal, it could be a petri dish. It could be animal cells in a petri dish. The question of where the origins came from is the question of where the animal is. And they've tested 96 animals in nature, and they've tested 0 animals at Wuhan Institute of Virology. That's where we need to look.
Thank you. I'll reserve the rest for a second round.
Senator Hassan, you're recognized for your questions.
Well, thanks, Chair Peters and Ranking Member Paul.
Dr. Gary indicated that the intelligence community was somewhat unified, or a lot of them believe this came from animals, and that's just not true. The ones that have been vocal about this and talked a lot about it have been the DOE, which has more scientists than any other agency in Washington, probably other than NIH. They've concluded that it did come from the lab. FBI concluded it came from the lab, and we have a whistleblower from the CIA that says the scientists that were convened to study this voted 6-1 to say it came from the lab, and then they were overruled by superiors for political reasons. So there's a lot of evidence that people within the intel agencies actually do believe that there is evidence that it came from the lab. In addition to people getting sick, there's also about a week in October where they do imagery of who's using a cell phone, and nobody's using a cell phone in the lab for about a week. So the lab's completely empty for about a week, and some people think that was during a cleanup period. But if you're sitting at home and you're sort of an independent, you hear scientists over here saying gain of function is the best thing since sliced bread, and over here you're saying, well, we really haven't developed any meaningful vaccines or technology from this, you're like, who do I believe? And who you believe does go to character. And so we have to look at some of the statements. Like I say, I've never seen anything like this between public and private statements. So Christian Anderson, early on in this, sends an email to Fauci, and his Fauci says, Bob Gary, and a couple of the other virologists, we think it's inconsistent. This virus, this genetic sequence of COVID is inconsistent with the expectations of evolutionary theory. So they believed it didn't come from nature. They had looked at this. These are smart people that when they were not looking at it, when they were trying to look at it through an objective lens, concluded one thing until they came to another conclusion that it might hurt the business of science and the arrangements they had going on with China, and concluded opposite. But with Christian Anderson, it's stark because he says, oh, Bob and all these, we all believe it's inconsistent with the expectations of evolutionary theory. A week later, Christian Anderson is saying, what I like to use when I talk to the public is, I like to tell them it's consistent with the expectations of evolutionary theory. So he goes from inconsistent to consistent, complete opposite approach within days, maybe even simultaneously as these papers are being written. So really the hypocrisy of those involved and those who are saying not a laboratory construct, if you want to know who to believe, look at their private statements versus their public statements. So we have gain of function is the best thing since sliced bread, or gain of function is a real problem. Now, Senator Romney's like, well, why does it matter if there's a chance we should do something? I think he's right. If you believe there's a 1% chance we should do something. But if you think there's a 1% chance, or you want to sort of glad hand people at the end and say, well, we should do something, their argument for the people who think it's not likely to happen is going to be, oh, the administration's already fixed this. It's already done, and all we need is a few little regulatory things. We don't need legislation. We don't need independent oversight. We don't need people looking at this who aren't on the receiving end of the money. This is the whole problem of NIH. The people regulating themselves are getting the money. So the administration has put in place some regulations to try to, help with the buying of select agents. And Dr. Quay, if you could explain to us what a few MIT scientists did recently and how well the administrative regulations are working without actual congressional legislation.
Sure. So 3 scientists at MIT said they were going to be a red team, and they contacted the FBI because what they were going to do was about to be potentially illegal. And they put together ricin and the 1918 influenza. Those 2 are select agents, and they're highly lethal. And they broke the genes up in a particular way. They added some benign genes, and then they put out test orders roughly following the White House guidelines, test orders to see if laboratories would send them the pieces they needed to build these viruses or ricin, or they would stop them. And in fact, in 94% of the time, they sent the pieces right to them. They purposely didn't make the active strain of the RNA. They made the inactive strain to show that they could do it. But they proved they could make ricin. They proved they could make the 1918 influenza under the guidance that have just come out of the White House in a way that
this gets at where we go forward. Our next hearing, or one of our next hearings, is going to be, what do we do for gain of function reform? What kind of committee do we set up to look at this? And if the answer is from the other side, oh, it's already done, the White House did it, this is showing you what the White House did, even if it was well-intentioned, didn't work. These scientists got the material off the internet to create the Spanish flu that killed 50, 100 million people. So this is not something we should scoff at and say, oh, it's not a laboratory construct. We don't do anything here. Let the administration do this. And I would say this if it were a Republican administration. I don't care which party it's in. I agree with scientists like Kevin Esvelt who equate this with nuclear weapons. This is incredibly important and needs congressional oversight on the select agents, but also on the gain of function. Now, some people think this just started. It's incredibly partisan. And I'll just for a quick answer, then a more extensive answer. Dr. Ebright, are you part of the right-wing conspiracy? Are you somehow some kind of crazy Republican partisan?
I'm a registered Democrat. I voted for Biden. I had a Biden sign on my lawn and had a Biden bumper sticker on my car.
That's enough of that. But the main point I wanted to make is this isn't a partisan thing. In fact, when I've talked to Dr. Ebright, he says he got involved with this after 9/11 when the anthrax attacks came. But then more involved in 2010 as it heated up, and everybody was talking about in the scientific community when scientists took the avian flu, which is very, very deadly in humans, but like most animal virus, not very transmissible in humans, and they mutated it, Faucier and others in Netherlands, to make it spread through the air and to spread to mammals. That's a crazy thing. And if people think that's a benign use of gain of function, we should never, ever listen to people like that. Who else thinks it was benign and we didn't need to do anything? Anthony Fauci. There have been these 2 camps. There has been this debate going on for a decade. I think this is a very good debate. It should be an intellectual debate, but realize these are the people, Collins and Fauci, who were saying, take these people down, take down the people we disagree with. This is not scientific debate. They were taking us off the internet. These are people are not playing under the American rules, not playing under the scientific method, and they should be discounted. But we have to have a real debate over this. So as we move forward, and I'd like to ask you, Dr. Ebright, on this, how important is it that we actually have a law passed and that we actually have regulators that are scientists, but that are outside of the supply of money, outside of the exchange of grant money?
I think it's a matter of survival. It's that important. There needs to be an entity that is independent of agencies that fund research and perform research to eliminate the structural conflict of interest that has existed with current self-regulation by agencies that perform and fund research.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Member Paul, you're recognized for your questions.
So the debate that Congress and the Senate will have to have is whether or not White House policy is enough. I think they're well-intentioned. I think they want to fix a problem that exists. But we've had this conversation before. In about 2010, 2011, when the avian flu was mutated to become aerosolized and more easily spread among mammals, there was a pause between 2014 and 2016. But throughout the pause, there were exemptions given to many research, and then there's some research that mysteriously just doesn't show up in any documents. So for example, the research in Wuhan that many of us believe evidence points towards the lab leak causing the pandemic was never reviewed. We then set up a committee called the P3CO committee, which was supposed to be in charge of looking at the safety of dangerous research. They looked at exactly 3 research projects. They complained and said, well, we didn't have the ability to go out and grab research. We could only take what was given to us. So there are limitations of the internal changes. In fact, one of the grave mistakes that was made is that the research in Wuhan was never even looked at by the P3CO committee. It was never paused. And Anthony Fauci will say, my people up and down told me it was not gain of function. And yet there's not one scrap of paper of any discussion ever occurring over whether it was gain of function or not. There have been camps for a long time. People say, oh, is this Republicans versus Democrats? No, but it's contentious, and there have been scientists on both sides of this from the very beginning. Really, probably all the way back to the Spanish flu in 2005, but certainly since 2010. And people need to realize that there are people on polar extremes, and Anthony Fauci was a polar extreme. He believed and he said in 2012 that even if a pandemic should occur, the knowledge was worth it. So I guess my question to begin for Dr. Redfield was, do you think that taking a coronavirus, the backbone of a SARS coronavirus, and swapping out S proteins from unknown viruses, do you think that's research that should be scrutinized for potentially being gain of function or dangerous? Does it bother you that the internal regulations that were put in place didn't seem to work to catch that Wuhan research?
Yes. I think the problem is the program can't be passive. And I think while I respect some of the improvements that happened with the May decisions that the White House has, I still think this is sort of a passive volunteer program for compliance. And so clearly, I think there has to be a much more active engagement. And one of the things that I want to come back to that I said earlier, and people will disagree with me, but I think they should reflect on what I'm about to say. In 2024, 2025, biosecurity is our nation's greatest national security threat. You need to think of it the same way we thought about the verge of nuclear, atomic, in the late 40s, 50s, and 60s. And, you know, Congress and our country was very aggressive in putting some standards around how we did nuclear research and where we did it. I think we have to have that same vigor towards this biological gain of function research right now. It has the potential to be much more catastrophic than, let's say, an isolated nuclear event.
So in preparing this bill to set up an independent board, we interviewed dozens of scientists. We asked them their opinions on this, what has to be done differently. And probably the number one thing people came back to us is that they believe the people making the judgment on the danger of the research should not be people dispensing money or receiving money, because it's just a conflict of interest. And accusations have been made. We don't know what people's motivations are, but when there are multi-million-dollar awards being given after certain opinions change or evolve over time, then the question is whether or not the money motivates the change. And really, so what we did in setting the independent commission up that we hope to pass into legislation is to have people who have, are no longer receiving, they could have been working for NIH, but they're no longer receiving benefits. They're not in the dispensing part, to try to get more objective look at this. We also put people on the committee that would have a national security look at this as well. And they can have both. People like Dr. Redfield have had both experiences of looking at national security and the science of this. And also, we don't ban anything. We don't ban gain of function research. It's really important what the definition is, and it requires some guidances and then scientists. But to Dr. Esvelt, do you think it's important that this be outside of the traditional NIH grant funding process and to get rid of conflict of interest, or do you think it can be done with in-house at NIH?
Thank you, Senator. I strongly believe that to provide trustworthy oversight, it has to be located outside the chains of funding in either direction, exactly as you outlined.
Dr. Resfeld, the history of this, if you could sort of review again, just because some people think this started with COVID, going back to Spanish flu and avian flu, that there's been really a long-running debate in the scientific community about the benefits. Some people say, well, as Anthony Fauci, the knowledge is always worth it, the risk doesn't matter, the knowledge is worth it. But then other people say we've never developed any vaccines from gain-of-function research and that it hasn't been nearly as productive as some would argue. Can you comment a little bit on the history of this debate, where the debate's going, and what your opinion is on Dr. Redfield? I'm sorry, I was directing that one back to Dr. Redfield.
I think it's an important debate to have, and I think you've highlighted. If I was sitting here 20 years ago, I would probably have the view that we may want to consider gain-of-function research as a way for us to get a jump start on countermeasures, because the pace of science was so slow. I know when I became CDC director, I was very concerned about a bird flu pandemic. And historically, if that occurred, it would likely take several years before we would have a vaccine or countermeasure. And so really for the first couple of years, it would just be a body count. But I will say the pace of science today is such that, and we saw it obviously with the COVID pandemic and the rapid development of the COVID vaccines, is such that we can really develop countermeasures really in weeks and months now. So I'm not of the view that we get such a jump start with gain-of-function research. And I do think there has to be a very aggressive debate of whether there's any benefit from that research. I think you are right. I'm not aware of any advanced therapeutic or vaccine that has come to pass because of gain-of-function research. So I'm still reticent. I do want to have a vigorous public debate about its benefit, and if it's determined that it has benefit, and I want society to be involved in that debate, not just scientists, then how do we do it in a safe, responsible, and effective way that protects our national security, which I do believe it has to be highly regulated.
Thank you. Senator Johnson, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record statements of support for my bill, Risky Research Review Act, from the scientific community and various stakeholder groups. Thank you.
Without objection, so ordered. I will now turn over the gavel to Ranking Member Paul, who will share the end of the meeting and bring us to a close. So with that, Ranking Member Paul, you now have the gavel.
Thank you. Dr. Wolinetz, during your tenure of working for Francis Collins, he sent an email to Anthony Fauci, and in the email he said that he directed Anthony Fauci to orchestrate a takedown of Drs. Koldorf and Bhattacharya. Were you aware of that email at the time?
I don't specifically recall it.
Okay. I want to remind the panel that you all continue to be under oath, and it is a crime to lie to Congress. Were you directed by Francis Collins to participate in a takedown, malignment, disparagement of either Drs. Koldorf or Bhattacharya?
No.
Did you plant any articles or discuss with anyone in the media articles that disparaged Dr. Koldorf or Bhattacharya or their positions?
No.
In Dr. Fauci's response to this email, he responds by saying, don't worry, this is a paraphrase, don't worry, Dr. Collins, I'm on it. I got a story planted in Wired and I think another lay publication, but he was actively doing Dr. Collins' bidding. So I am surprised that as the Chief of Staff, you had no awareness of that there was a policy of taking down these scientists. Dr. Parker, you've had long, distinguished careers. Have you ever directed any of your employees to take down fellow scientists who you disagreed with?
No.
Dr. Redfield, you've had a long and distinguished career. Have you ever directed any of your employees to take down scientists who you had a disagreement with?
No.
Dr. Esvelt, same question.
No.
Dr. Wolinetz, did you attend the gain-of-function dual-use research of concern meetings during your tenure in government?
Yes.
Were you considered to be a member
A member of what specifically,
I don't know,
Senator?
is there a group called that? Is it a meeting? Who gets to go? Were you?
So I participated in many groups inside government in which biosecurity, management
This
of
is a very
dual-use
specific
research.
meeting, though. This is the week, it's called in this email, Weekly Dual-Use Research of Concern, Gain of Function Meeting. Did you attend those routinely?
I don't recall a meeting called that, although it's quite possible I was involved. That name doesn't ring a
This
bell.
would be a meeting to discuss things that might be gain of function. Did you attend those meetings?
No, not if they were meetings at the level of an individual NIH institute to review research. I was not at all involved in that process.
This is a email. It's from Teresa, I don't know how you pronounce it, Hogwell? How do you know how to say it? H-A-U-G-U-E-L, and it's to, let's see, and Irene Glowinski, Dennis Dixon, Linda Lambert, David Spiro. You familiar with those names?
I believe those are all employees of NIAID.
Okay. So you think this meeting may have occurred within NIAID and you might not have participated in it?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Are you surprised that when I ask for the debate over what is and what is not, because there's a debate over what is the definition of gain of function, that the NIH still refuses to give me minutes of these meetings or any of the discussion concerning what is gain of function and what is not gain of function?
I can't speak to NIH's decision.
Do you think that's an appropriate policy for the NIH to refuse to give members of Congress the debate over whether something is or is not gain of function?
My general philosophy at NIH was to always be as cooperative with members of Congress as humanly possible.
Your boss, not so much. When he was for that when he wasn't busy taking down fellow scientific colleagues. Dr. Parker, do you think it's appropriate for the NIH to refuse to give Congress the minutes or deliberations over what is or what is not gain of function, particularly concerning research that was done in Wuhan?
Inappropriate.
Dr. Redfield, do you think the NIH should release, do you think it's inappropriate that they won't release, and should they release the information concerning the deliberations over gain of function?
Yeah, I think it's inappropriate that they don't share that information.
Dr. Esfeld, do you think it's inappropriate that the NIH continues to refuse to reveal information considering the deliberations over gain of function?
I think transparency is essential to public trust in science, and I think NIH has a duty to uphold public trust in science insofar as possible.
The public needs to realize that I only know of this meeting existing because of a Freedom of Information Act. The Senate, groups of senators, the ranking member of a committee, they will not reveal they even have the meeting, much less the minutes of the meeting. I can get more information from the CIA than the NIH. Dr. Redfield, do you think that damages science when the science are acting like the CIA and not revealing information? Does it damage our trust in science?
I think it's going to be very hard for public trust to be regained, at NIH, CDC, FDA, from what we experienced in the COVID pandemic.
Dr. Redfield, do you think, we talked a little bit about this before, but taking the backbone of a SARS virus and adding various S proteins from other unknown viruses to see what you get, running through that through serial passage, should that have gone before some sort of gain of function review, even if it, to figure out whether it meets a definition of dangerous research?
Yes.
One of Anthony Fauci's responses has been, well, they're two animal viruses and we don't know that they will infect humans. But by the time you combine them, the test they do is they actually test them to see if they infect human cells after they're done manipulating them. So their goal really is to see, hey guys, do you think we can make it more infectious? And yet they say, and they hide behind definitions of, well, we didn't know in advance. And this becomes the problem. And look, I come from a scientific background. I'm aware of CRISPR technology, not enough to do it, but aware of the great benefits of science. I'm aware of creating bacteria that make insulin. I'm not against any of those kind of things. But I do want scientists like yourselves to be on some sort of committee to overlook this. But I get the feeling that over and over again, this has been hidden and been in-house. There was actually, and I'm trying to remember if it's the same board that you led, Dr. Parker, but it's the NAA, remind me the acronym for your board?
NSABB.
And you're still ahead of it.
I'm still a member of the committee, but any of my comments today are not reflective. They're on
Okay.
my
And I won't put you on the spot on this, but there's a story from like 4, 8, 10 years ago of like a whole bunch of people being fired by Dr. Fauci because they disagreed with his opinion on gain of function. And so it's just another indication that we can't have this all within house and it's like, oh, no big deal. There really has to be some independent people outside of government to look at that. And that's what I emphasize over and over, is that we have to get to some sort of independent board here. Dr. Wolanich, you were a member of the PC 3.0 committee, correct?
That's correct.
Who were the other members?
I don't recall all of them off the top of my head. There were about a dozen. I know there were representatives from ASPR, from the communications, Bill Hall at HHS. It's been a while.
Are you aware that they were also refusing to give us the names? I think the names have been published by the COVID committee. They've been refusing to give the names of the people on the COVID committee. I mean, on the.
As a member of the committee, previous member of the committee, I have no objection to the names being released.
But you can see the problem. So you set up an oversight committee, but the oversight committee never saw the Wuhan research. Should the Wuhan research, taking a SARS backbone and putting a new S protein on it and running through human cells to see if it infects, and then it turns out it did, and then we say, oh, it's only 1,000 times more, and we'll give you more leeway to do it, et cetera, all the stuff that happened with EcoHealth. In retrospect, should that have gone before the P3CO committee?
So, Senator Paul, I think one of the things I've learned in engaging this, particularly as a non-virologist myself, although I'm a scientist, I don't know that much about virology, is that it's really important to have expertise to be able to evaluate that benefit and risk and talk about whether or not it meets the scopes of these policies. However, I do agree that, and I'm glad we're discussing whether or not there is an opportunity to do this better, to introduce independence earlier in the process.
That's a general answer, and that's fine. But very specifically, should the research putting a new S protein, a random S protein from a random unknown virus on a SARS backbone, creating an infectious chimera, and then deciding or looking to see if it infects human cells more, should that have gone before the P3CO committee, yes or no?
I do not know enough about the research to be able to make that. That was why I was not part of the process that referred
That's
it.
really disappointing, and I mean, would exclude me from considering you for any board, frankly, if you can't admit, I mean, because you're still in your mind thinking, oh, I don't want to criticize Francis Collins, or I don't want to criticize Anthony Fauci, because this is your group, you know. But in retrospect, 15 million people died. The Department of Energy have concluded it came from the lab. So has the FBI. So did the CIA, until higher-ups at the CIA told them to change their opinion. But the group of scientists at the CIA, according to a whistleblower, voted 6-1. Look at what we're faced with. And people wonder about vaccine hesitancy or hesitancy of science. If you look at the information, for example, one of the strongest circumstantial evidence that they may have done this in the lab and that the furin cleavage site may have been added is the fact that in 2018, Dr. Shi and Dr. Barrick presented something called the diffuse proposal. Are you aware of the diffuse proposal?
I've read about it in the news, but I was not aware about it contemporaneously.
Contemporaneously, you weren't aware of it?
No, I'd never heard of it.
And here's the thing. Do you know how I'm aware of it? The NIH didn't tell me. The HHS didn't tell me. No one in government told me. A colonel in the Marines who worked for DARPA told me, under the protection of the whistleblower statute. In our government, we're concerned the Chinese lied to us and that they are distrustful, which is probably true. But in our government, you know, you may not have liked the tone of the other senators, but this is what we're faced with. The diffuse proposal was never told to us. In the diffuse proposal, it was a proposal to take a coronavirus, put a furin cleavage site in it, and test it to see if it was more infectious in humans. What did COVID-19 turn out to be? A very unusual, if not the first sarbecovirus in a family of viruses to have a furin cleavage site. It's why alarm bells went off in all of Anthony Fauci's cronies that were all saying it came from the lab, it looks like it was engineered, until they were convinced somehow within days to write the proximal origin paper saying it wasn't, and calling everybody crazy and a conspiracy theorist, and calling Facebook and everybody else and saying, take down, don't give any credence to these people. So you see what has happened to science. Francis Collins, your boss, at one point says, It's about, damage to science. If anybody mentions that this might have come from a lab, it will damage science. Other people were saying it will damage our relations with China. So the truth wasn't so important. It was the business of science, the billions of dollars changing hand. And you and your boss, this whole cabal has created such damage to science in this, and it continues to this day. They will not give me the deliberations. We're not talking about secrets. We're not talking about informants. We're not talking about spies. I'm talking about scientists in my own government. Will not give me the deliberations on whether or not the research in Wuhan was. You still to this day won't admit it, even though the Department of Energy, FBI, and maybe as much as half of the scientific community are convinced it came from the lab. Even some might say it's 5% chance it came from the lab, and yet you won't admit that it's dangerous research. To this day, you will still sit there and say you're unable to judge whether the research going on in Wuhan was dangerous.
Senator Paul, I will say that the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic is unknown. When I was in the government, I had a high level of clearance and received the intelligence briefings to which you are referring. And my general conclusion is that there was a lack of consensus among analysts across the federal government. It was not as cut and dried as you are making it sound. I cannot speak to the innermost thoughts of anyone at NIH, but I will say in my personal experience, I never knew any of the scientists at NIH to be anything but open-minded because they thought that the information was power in being able to develop the diagnostics, treatments, and countermeasures, as well as future policies to help both address the COVID-19 pandemic and respond to future pandemics.
Dr. Wolenitz, have you visited the Rocky Mountain Lab?
No, I've never been there.
Were you aware of that the proposal to do the Diffuse project involved laboratory work that was to be done at the Rocky Mountain Lab?
No, as I said, I was not aware of the Diffuse proposal.
Okay. Senator Marshall.
Thank you, Senator Paul. Dr. Wolenitz.
Ranking Member Paul for his opening remarks.
Since 2020, American families, communities, and businesses have borne the devastating consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. Lives were unnecessarily lost. Civil liberties were unilaterally stripped away by government bureaucrats. Taxpayers will carry the burden of the trillions of dollars borrowed and spent by the government for decades and generations to come. From the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic, Dr. Fauci and others within our government orchestrated a concerted effort to stifle any debate over the virus's origins. They coordinated the now debunked proximal origins paper, despite acknowledging privately that the virus looked engineered. The purpose of this vast cover-up, it now seems, was to conceal the dangerous biological research NIH and other government agencies were funding, both abroad and here at home. Over the last 4 years, compelling evidence has emerged supporting the lab origin of the pandemic and unraveling a web of deception, the vast COVID cover-up. We learned that the NIH funneled federal dollars through EcoHealth Alliance to support gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, research that may have caused the pandemic. We learned that multiple federal agencies sent taxpayer funds to China's Academy of Military Medical Sciences supporting PLA research. Most recently, the Department of Defense Inspector General found that the DoD is unable to fully account for the money that is sent to labs in China because the DoD does not track funding it sends abroad for pathogen research. So what has been done since the uncovering that our government was funding dangerous virus research overseas with little or no oversight? The answer is stark and chilling, virtually nothing. Some prefer this inaction, finding comfort in the shadows of bureaucracy and secrecy. They want Congress to remain passive, to accept their reassurances without question. We've fixed it. The problem's done. Nothing to see here. But we cannot stand idly by. We must demand accountability, strive for transparency, and ensure the safety of our citizens is never again compromised by negligence or deceit. You don't need to be convinced that COVID-19 virus originated from a lab leak to recognize the imminent need for oversight mechanisms. The mere possibility that the virus could have emerged from such risky research should be more than enough to prompt decisive action. How can we trust in a system that so blatantly ignores its own safeguards? How can we believe in leadership that permits such dangerous research without conducting stringent oversight, risking global health for the sake of dubious scientific advancement? This is not merely a failure, it's a betrayal of public trust. We sit here today at a critical juncture, facing what many believe is the nuclear threat of our time, gain-of-function research. Manipulating viruses to make them more lethal poses a danger akin to that of an atomic bomb. In this dystopian reality we find ourselves in, it is our duty to challenge the status quo, to shine a light on the darkest corners of government operations, and to protect the freedoms and lives of the people we serve. The era of complacency must end, and change must begin with us. We must demand accountability for the grave oversights that were revealed by the COVID-19 pandemic. The safety of our nation and the trust of its institutions depends on it. This is why yesterday I introduced the Risky Research Review Act to codify an independent oversight of dangerous scientific research funded by the federal government. My bill would establish an independent board within the executive branch to oversee federal funding for high-risk life sciences research, ensuring the protection of public health, safety, and national security. The board would be comprised of non-government, scientific, and national security experts who would have the responsibility of reviewing and approving high-risk life sciences research proposals prior to the release of federal funds. The bill would also implement mechanisms to ensure accountability from agencies and applicants applying for federal funds to conduct high-risk research. My bill not only strengthens transparency, but also ensures that public health decisions are made in the best interests of the American people, free from financial motives and prioritizing national security. The Risky Research Review Act is endorsed by stakeholder groups and distinguished scientists, including the former director of the Centers for Disease Control, who is here with us today, Dr. Robert Redfield. According to Dr. Redfield, if the Risky Research Review Act had been in place, it might have prevented the COVID-19 pandemic. I urge the chairman and other members of this committee to support the legislation, which will begin to restore trust in science, our scientific community, and faith in our government institutions. Together, we can prioritize the national security of Americans, ensuring that we never again face such a preventable devastation.
It is the practice of this committee to swear in witnesses. So if each of you would please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony that you will give before this committee will be